Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief for December 31st, 2022. This is the final episode of the Rogers Brief for this year, and I'm going to be doing something of a retrospective over the last year, looking back at 2022 in Canadian law with something of a Nova Scotia focus, but as you'll see, most of these issues are sort of national in scope as well. And I'll look ahead a little bit to 2023. I hope everybody had a good holiday break. In legal circles, the holiday season is usually fairly quiet. The only things that typically take place, and I get the court dockets, provincial court criminal dockets, and they're quite quiet for this time of year. The only things that usually take place are either bail hearings. Somebody needs to get out of jail or wants to get out of jail before Christmas. And the other thing that takes place are emergency custody disputes. So you don't want to be involved in either one of those if you can help it. It's unpleasant and uncertain. It's just often brings home for people the importance of having a clear, clearly delineated custody agreement or custody order, depending on how you've arrived at that custody situation. Typically, it's people that are in the first year of a separation that thought they were going to be able to work out Christmas one way or another and get to Christmas and find out that they had a different view than their spouse or former spouse. So some of those tend to come up. Anyway, usually it's you alternate Christmases, alternate Boxing Days, and those sorts of things. So should try to have those clear if they aren't already. Anyway, so hope everybody was not involved in anything like that and had a good Christmas. I had a good Christmas here myself, fairly quiet. I got a nice little gift. This was from my brother. You can see I got a new light when this, if I hit the button and light that up, so people will know not to disturb me while I'm recording these videos. So kind of a fun little gift. So I'm going to look back at, like I say, some of 2022, some of the highlights and some of the inquiries that we've been covering through the Rogers Brief. As well, there's been some significant Supreme Court of Canada decisions back in 2022. The mandatory minimum sentencing regime from the previous Conservative government, which had been challenged a number of times, was confirmed in the Sherma decision. There was quite a few, actually, decisions. I was looking back through the Supreme Court decision archive for the year, and there were quite a few decisions on the right to counsel in a criminal situation, which was kind of interesting given, if anybody's following my reports on the Mass Casualty Commission and how the spouse of the gunman, Lisa Banfield, was not given right to counsel during her initial interviews. I think some of these Supreme Court of Canada decisions that came down this year would have really supported her application if she had had to make one to have that evidence excluded had she been charged with something seriously, or had the supplying ammunition charge been seriously pursued against her. I think she would have found some material in these Supreme Court of Canada decisions from this year to right to counsel. The other interesting Supreme Court of Canada decision that came out this year, actually there was a pair of them, that was on automaton defense. So if somebody ingests something, drugs in these cases, which they had no way of knowing would have led them to be a complete automaton with no control over their mental or physical faculties, and they commit a crime during that state of being, that was a defense that was confirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada this year. Lawyers would have been taught the automaton cases through people that sleptwalk. There was a few, notable cases of sleepwalkers who committed crimes and they were found not guilty because of the automaton defense. Anyway, that's now been confirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada for drug-induced defenses. Now, if you take a drug that you know yourself is going to have a certain effect, you can't use that defense, but if it was something uncertain, then you could. Okay, so those were some of the Supreme Court of Canada highlights over the year. Be looking next year. The Supreme Court of Canada always has interesting cases on the go. I'll be looking to see whether any of the COVID-related litigation makes it to that level. There's a few cases across the country. There was a Newfoundland injunction case. There was a Nova Scotia injunction case, which actually the injunction was granted to prevent a gathering back in the spring that was planned. But then that litigation made it through, and the injunction, the Court of Appeal in Nova Scotia overturned that injunction retrospectively. I mean, the situation had already gone past. I don't think, but you never know, whether the Supreme Court of Canada may be asked to address that decision. I don't think the Crown was appealing that decision, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some more COVID-related litigation that makes it to our courts in 2023. And we'll see how that falls out. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I talk about the inquiries that are happening and potentially happening, because that's one that may potentially happen. The other thing I'm looking forward to legal-wise in 2023 are some of these fisheries issues. In last year, more than a year, I guess now, especially on the East Coast, there's been fisheries disputes between First Nations groups looking to, not take advantage of, but use their right to fish that was provided through the Marshall decisions, Supreme Court of Canada decisions in the Donald Marshall cases, to fish. And Supreme Court of Canada said that yes, they have the right to fish. The government has some rights to regulate those. There hasn't been a system put in place yet to really put all of that language, which was fairly clearly stated in the Supreme Court of Canada decisions, into policy, into action by the Federal Department of Fisheries. And so those have led to disputes on the water, disputes at the wharves, buyers put in difficult positions about whether they can purchase certain lobsters. And so all of that has led to hard feelings and conflict. The government has really been absent on that. I'd be interested to see whether they try to bring in any legislation or do something at least over the course of the next year to clarify that and reduce the temperature on the wharves and out on the water, especially here on the East Coast. So something I'll be watching for. 2022 year in review. I want to look back at some of the inquiries, and there are 4 that I want to discuss. 3 that took place this year and will be reporting in 2023, and 1 that may potentially take place in 2023. 2 of them, which are the Desmond Inquiry and the Mass Casualty Commission, have a Nova Scotia focus. They took place here in Nova Scotia, but really have national issues. The other that I'll talk about is the Emergencies Act inquiry, the Public Order Emergency Commission. Okay, so the Desmond Inquiry, it's a little bit in the past now, but we'll be hearing about this again this year because the final report from Provincial Court Judge Warren Zimmer will be coming out probably fairly early in 2023, although he's a judge working on this alone with a similar level of documentation to these other inquiries, and so it's a difficult task for one person to do. This was a provincial fatality inquiry, so not a federal inquiry. It wasn't a joint inquiry. This was a provincial only. The federal government was participating, but it's kind of peculiar from the beginning because this was a Canadian Armed Forces veteran who was home in Geisborough County, not far from here where I am actually. And on January 3rd of 2017, he took the lives of his wife, his daughter, and his mother, and then ultimately himself. And it was issues of mental health treatment in the provincial system were initially raised. What emerged was that the, Corporal Desmond, who I represented in the inquiry, had been treated in the federal system by Veterans Affairs, by the Canadian Armed Forces, and then was sent home without really any support or any guidance to his family, who were also not provided with any support or guidance as to how to reintegrate somebody into a family situation. And he had severe PTSD issues, but none of those medical records were provided from the federal system to the provincial system. And so it's a situation where, this is something that happens all the time. Soldiers are discharged, they retire from the military, and then they go home, and then all of a sudden their health needs are being provided for by the provincial systems. But the provincial system knows nothing about the complicated history that individual might have in the federal system. So lots to learn there, and some integration of the two health systems. PTSD itself, people may think that this is a well-known condition. I can tell you from listening to the experts through the Desmond Inquiry that it is not all as well known as people may expect. In Desmond's case in particular, he had these dissociative episodes where he would be back in Afghanistan or off in another place, even though he seems like he's here and talking to a person. But and in fact, during the killings themselves, there's strong evidence to suggest that he committed those during a dissociative episode. So it really truly wasn't him doing so during that time. So the PTSD, there's much to learn there. And then just the whole reintegration of soldiers to their families and their communities, which is a valuable thing. These men and women bring back valuable skills and experience. Can be very productive members of their communities. Take on new roles, new professions. But that initial reintegration has to take place in a much better way. So all of this is going to have major effects on Canadian Armed Forces recruiting in the future, I believe. And then I think also, the government needs to look at this as when we're being asked as a country to contribute soldiers to a certain, theater of war or conflict. Was Afghanistan, a known entity? It seems like the soldiers that came back from there said it was just a hellscape. Very, very foreign country to what we're used to, and so I think more preparation needs to be done in terms of that choice of going into certain countries. I wondered whether the hesitancy of the Canadian government to contribute soldiers to the operation in Mali was somehow influenced by the experiences of Afghanistan, going into a country where it was a lot of uncertainty. And so anyway, we'll see if that affects things in the future. Look forward to Judge Zimmer's report, hopefully early in the new year. I expect that there's going to be work for Nova Scotia Health to do in that respect, probably other provincial health systems as well, and then Veterans Affairs, the Federal Department of Veterans Affairs, and Canadian Armed Forces working on integrating those health systems. And I expect that there'll be an implementation committee or process part of Judge Zimmer's recommendations. Okay, so that is the Desmond Inquiry, a provincial inquiry of national effect. The next inquiry that's gone on all year and is still taking place is the Mass Casualty Commission, which of course resulted from or emerged from the mass killings in Nova Scotia of 2020, April 18th and 19th, 2020, by Gabriel Wortman in Portapique, Nova Scotia, and other areas in central Nova Scotia. This was so after that, the issues around emergency alerting of citizens, of police preparation, police capacity and capabilities to face an active shooter situation, all raised as issues early on, and they were the subject of a joint federal-provincial inquiry, a very expensive inquiry, certainly the most costly, I'm sure, of the three inquiries that I'll be discussing here, active inquiries. These were three non-judge commissioners. One was a former judge, but had been he was retired and not serving as a judge at the time. Had a very large research staff, public relations staff, unlike the Desmond Inquiry, which really just had Judge Zimmer and a few court staff. It went on the Mass Casualty Commission it was supposed to start last October of 2021. Didn't start until February, of 2022 wrapped up in early October, although since it wrapped up, so-called, in October, there's been more information emerging since then, more exhibits being filed and released. The final report, which was scheduled to be released in November 1st, 2022, is now coming at the end of March, so a 5-month delay there. Going to be talking about Alert Ready, about the future of the RCMP in Nova Scotia and in Canada. Indeed, I think if there's a recommendation in this report, which I don't quite expect there to be, but if there is a recommendation, because many people have looked at this situation and been critical of the RCMP's performance and then their public communications, that the future of the RCMP is going to be an open question. The other thing that's come up is the treatment of domestic violence allegations and how the police should be treating those, how courts should be looking at domestic violence allegations, whether the treating them through the criminal law system is the best way to ensure community safety and so that's certainly an open question. It seems like the answer coming through is that it shouldn't be a criminal justice focus to domestic violence, that there should be more of a public health approach to domestic violence situations. So I'd be curious to see whether the commission has, I guess, the courage to make that kind of a recommendation. Currently in Nova Scotia, the Public Prosecution Service will not even do adult diversion or restorative justice approaches to domestic violence cases for policy reasons. It's not that it doesn't work, it's that they want to be seen to be taking domestic violence seriously, which is a good instinct, but the methods that they choose to use don't really seem to work. They just lead to more conflict and break up families that, some counseling and treatment would help reintegrate and improve those situations. And in many cases lead to people not reporting legitimate domestic violence situations because they don't want to have their spouse face all those consequences, which end up hurting the entire family. So I think there's some real work to be done there. The other thing that the commission is going to be asked to look at, but I don't think they will really address, is going to be this political interference angle that was explored throughout the summer with these sort of explosive allegations from Superintendent Darren Campbell against Commissioner Brenda Lucki, and this was brought into the Public Safety Committee in Parliament. So all of these issues of whether the federal government was trying to pressure the RCMP into releasing certain makes and models of firearms that the killer had used, and whether there was political pressure to do so, and not only political pressure but improper political pressure or interference. I don't think the commission is going to really address those questions. I think they'll just, they may mention that there was some dispute, but I don't think it substantively is going to contribute to what they're trying to discuss, so I don't think they're going to touch it. I think they'll just leave that alone. Now, when this report comes out at the end of March, unlike the Desmond Inquiry, I think once the Desmond Inquiry report comes out, people are going to read what Judge Zimmer has written and say, okay, that's what we shall do then. Conversely, when the Mass Casualty Commission issues their report, I think people are going to say, okay, I'm not sure about that one. I think, the Desmond Inquiry recommendations are going to be accepted as legitimate. The Mass Casualty Commission doesn't have the inherent credibility, and so I think they have an additional burden to persuade citizens and government decision makers that what they recommend is truly what should be done. People that have followed my work here will know that I've written an alternate report called Deficits of Trust. It's an ebook. It can be read. I'm reading some out loud too for people that would prefer to get them by video or by podcast. But in my recommendations, I'm looking at replacing the RCMP as a police force in Nova Scotia, make some recommendations around the domestic violence question, on public alerting, all those things. I'd be very curious to see how those compare to what the commission themselves recommend, and then what the people that have been following this and the government decision makers view as being legitimate and useful recommendations. So we'll see. But I think really, in addition to whatever substantive recommendations the Mass Casualty Commission makes, the Commission itself in the future is going to be raised as an example of how not to run an inquiry. It was this trauma-informed mandate that really prevented us from hearing from witnesses, prevented us from seeing certain video evidence, even though it wasn't particularly gruesome or graphic in any way. The effort that they made to try to protect senior police officers and, in their minds, I think, try to protect the public from hearing unpleasant things, I think that'll be viewed now as the way not to do an inquiry. Now, I'll use that as a segue to switch over to the Public Order Emergency Commission, because I thought Justice Rouleau, who ran that commission, did a really good job of this. Now, this was the public order. The legislation requires, so the Emergency Act was invoked on February 14th last year of 2022, and the legislation requires that within 360 days there be an inquiry held and a report issued. So we'll get a report on the Public Order Emergency Inquiry in early February. So it's kind of funny in a way. The whole entire Public Order Emergency Commission, that entire inquiry, national inquiry in scope, is going to take place and issue a report during the time frame between the Mass Casualty Commission hearings ending in early October and their report being issued. So while the three commissioners and their big PR staff and research staff are writing the Mass Casualty Commission report, which may or may not be a legitimate report when it comes out, the Public Order Emergency Commission has taken place entirely. So it really shows you what can be done if people set their minds to it. Now there was there's a particular decision that Justice Rouleau needs to make, which is whether the Emergency Act was invoked properly, whether it was legitimate to invoke it under the circumstances. The trucker convoy, the Freedom Convoy, the trucker protest, whatever was in Ottawa, was in different places, border crossings in Canada, Windsor and Coutts, Alberta. So, but there's a particular threshold that the Emergencies Act inquiry needs to reach, whether that was serious enough to invoke the Emergency Act inquiry. Others, the Mass Casualty Commission and the Desmond Inquiry, have terms of reference, questions that they need to answer, but the Public Order Emergency is legislated to answer a particular question. I thought the inquiry process was very good. There were, like I say, timely hearings. It happened quickly. Unlike, the Desmond Inquiry took place over 4 years. There was COVID was in the middle of it, interrupted things, but it took a while to get going, and it took a while to complete. Mass Casualty Commission was delayed. This was a year and a half later that it was supposed to get started. It was almost 2 years by the time it got started, whereas the Public Order Emergency Commission is taking place entirely within a year. So, the old saying of justice delayed is justice denied. Justice took place quickly with the Public Order Emergency Commission. The report is due February 6th. They had, like I say, timely hearings. The final report is going to be a timely report. They had witnesses right from the beginning. They allowed cross-examination, unlike the Mass Casualty Commission. They had some time limits on cross-examination because they had many parties that needed to ask questions. So that was time limits were set. That seemed to work fine as well. What's the outcome going to be? That's everybody's question now. Like Justice Rouleau, I think, he has two questions. One is, what is the definition of an emergency? And I think he's going to adopt the broader definition that the government has asked him to adopt, rather than a more narrow one, which I know the convoy is looking to have adopted, it's included in the CSIS Act. There was a reference to the CSIS Act of what an emergency might involve, and that is sort of an external threat to the integrity of the country. Well, that has a particular definition or interpretation if you're thinking it from the spy agency's perspective, but it's a different interpretation from the government's perspective in a broader sense. And I think Justice Rouleau will adopt that broader definition. But then the next question is, well, was it still the right thing to do to invoke the act? Well, we heard that many of the advisors, security agencies, policing, were all advising the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to invoke the act, and nobody was really saying no. Now, Brenda Lucki, again, the Commissioner of the RCMP, thought there was alternative police methods that could have been used, but she didn't speak up when she had the opportunity to do so. So the Prime Minister was left with advice to invoke the act. So it's good cover for a decision if that's the decision you want to make. The problem is we've lots of evidence that this wasn't really a political issue or a legal issue, but rather a police and a logistics issue. That the police just weren't organized enough to face the truckers. They didn't anticipate them properly, even though there was lots of evidence to say that they were on their way to Ottawa. So it'd be a difficult decision in a way for Justice Rouleau to make whether this was legitimate. In an idealized world or a better world where you had better police forces that were more organized and had better leadership, you wouldn't need this. But that's not what we had. We had the Ottawa police force, which were a mess. We had the Ontario police force, which seemed to see things coming, but wasn't always involved. And a mixture of police forces in Ottawa. We had the RCMP, the Ottawa police, the Ontario police, all sort of struggling to work together. So that seemed to be the real issue, but I think Justice Rouleau is going to say, well, you have to take that into account as one of the factors is that you had a police force that was a little disorganized. And if that's the case, maybe you need this other legislation in order to get people acting. But it seems like the invoking of the Emergencies Act was more of a psychological issue than a legal issue, and I don't think that's enough. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is looking ahead a little bit to 2023 is another potential inquiry. And I mentioned this probably a month and a half ago because there was a news event, press release with this National Citizens Inquiry. And they had Preston Manning and a few other prominent people, but mostly Preston Manning, I guess, as far as people would know, looking at doing a privately funded inquiry into the government's actions during the pandemic. And I know the Nova Scotia Civil Liberties Association has talked about doing something like this on a provincial scale in Nova Scotia to see, all right, what was done. So the two main areas that would be explored would be, one, the new laws that were brought in restricting freedom and liberty. So, laws are typically developed over the course of months or years. There's a lot more deliberation that takes place. Here, there was, lockdown regulations. You couldn't cross borders, gathering limits. All of these mandatory restrictions on freedom that were brought in very quickly without really a lot of deliberation, very little oversight. The Parliament wasn't sitting regularly. There was, virtual parliaments. I noticed as well that the, ministers of justice typically weren't involved in press conferences to explain the new laws. It was always the, health minister or the, the prime minister or premiers of provinces, health officials. It was never justice officials that were there to explain what the new laws meant, how they were compliant with the charter, or if they weren't compliant with the charter, why that was okay under the emergency circumstances that we were facing. So I think that's going to be one area of debate about how laws are brought in under emergency circumstances. The second thing, of course, is the financial side of it, which is, the funding of, everybody's income to make sure that, all right, if you're locked down, that the society can still function. And, you know, but the question will be, was that done properly? There's, broadly speaking, two ways that governments can get money. They needed money. Well, they could have obtained that from private wealth through taxation, emergency taxation, as was done in wartime before, or they could have done it through what they call quantitative easing, which is basically printing money. Well, quantitative easing looks, it leads to inflation because, you just add more money to the system. You're not adding more goods, you're just adding more money, printing money essentially. And so then the price of things goes up and up and up, and we've seen that. Now, was that because of a lack of oversight and a lack of, lack of information being provided to the public by the government, lack of, oversight on new spending regulations? So I think there'll be a question about how emergency funding works under those circumstances. The inflation that we're facing now is a direct result of the billions that were spent. And we heard from the Auditor General just a few weeks ago in Canada that there was $32 billion potentially overspent. Now, it wasn't that long ago that a few $1 billion was a significant government deficit over the course of a year, or government debt. Now we have potentially $32 billion overspent. 4.6 billion was definitely spent as overpayments, and the Auditor General said 27.4 billion should be investigated. So $32 billion potentially overspent during the pandemic. So not only does that lead to inflation, it also leads to further sort of wealth concentration at the upper end of the wealth spectrum. Thomas Piketty, who's actually, book is right there, who's the sort of leading international voice. He's a French economist, voice on wealth inequality, has talked about how during the pandemic, the wealth inequality has gotten even worse now that the billionaires now own 3.5% of all of the wealth, and that's gone up by 4.1 trillion that was as of late 2021. Anyway, it's while many people are struggling, the billionaires have gotten richer and richer during the pandemic. Why? Well, two reasons mainly. One is financial markets. Governments are borrowing money to fund the money that they've been sending out to citizens. Rather than taxing it, they've been borrowing it, which, anyway, it can be a little complicated, but they're essentially printing money, borrowing money, making the people, the private entities that can lend money to governments, that much wealthier. That money, in many cases, is going back into real estate markets, which are inflating real estate markets as well. So there's lots of inflationary pressures on regular people, and meanwhile the super rich are getting super richer, and all of that could have been, if not avoided entirely, there could have been a different approach to it had they had governments gone after the super wealthy initially and been a lot more careful about how they spent some of the money as well. $32 billion potentially overspent in just in Canada. Imagine what that looks like internationally, and how that can all lead to extra inflationary pressures. So what's going to happen? Well, if this National Citizens Inquiry, and they've got 40,000 signatures looking for to support their inquiry. If they get off the ground with this inquiry, I'd be very curious to see how it goes. Actually, they're seeking commissioners. I'm not sure. So a private inquiry is not the same legitimacy. It doesn't have the same legitimacy as a government-run inquiry, in a sense. However, if you get loss of participation from non-governmental entities, then why not? If the conclusions are persuasive, if the expertise is neutral, if there are people from all walks of life that are able to, that are, persuaded to come and talk about what they've observed over the last few years, then, a private inquiry can have just as much influence as a public inquiry. It'll be just a matter of whether they get the funding to make it happen and whether, legitimate experts contribute their legitimate expertise. Given, I know they've had a few events already, a 3-day event and a few webinars, and they've had some very interesting people, some legitimate experts contributing there, so I wouldn't be surprised if they were able to obtain more legitimacy and more legitimate experts as they go along. Okay, so I'll be watching for those developments over the course of the year. So we'll see. We'll have the reports from the Desmond Inquiry, reports from the Mass Casualty Commission. We'll have the report from the Public Order Emergency Commission. So certainly 3 reports from commissions of inquiry of different kinds this year, early this year, hopefully. So we'll have those to review. I'm sure there'll be implementation committees for all 3. And then in the course of the 2023, we'll also learn whether there'll be a COVID-19 pandemic privately funded inquiry and what shape that may take as well. So I'll be watching all of that as the new year unfolds. I'll be watching for news out of the Supreme Court of Canada, courts of appeal from across the country, provincial courts of appeal, and other legal news or news with significant or underappreciated legal angles. So I want to wish everybody a happy new year. Thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks for listening to my YouTube channel, my podcast over the course of 2022. It's been a really interesting year for me. I've really enjoyed bringing this content to you. I hope you enjoy it, and you join me again in 2022. We'll keep the Rogers Brief going, and with your help and feedback, look forward to bringing you more insight and information. So until then, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.